Welcome to Northwest Tech Show. I'm Dave Duncan, and this is a show where we talk about technology and how a better knowledge of it can help you have better outcomes at home, at work, and in your civic engagements. We're going to kick things off, as we like to do, with a bit of Creative Commons content from the folks at twit.tv. This is from Tech News Weekly, GDPR and Terms of Service Clarity.
This is Twit. I do a lot of reading in my daily life. I also do a lot of signing up for things online, but rarely do I do a lot of reading of terms of services when I sign up for things online because A, apparently I'm kind of lazy, and B, have you seen the terms of service on some of these sites? My eyes, anyways, I don't know about you, Megan, glaze over when I'm confronted with that like large wall of text, pages upon pages worth. And sure, I have myself to blame, but I'm certainly not alone in feeling like sometimes companies know this is going to happen and they slip things in there to capitalize on that. Joining us to talk about the terms of service reckoning, as he calls it, is Nate Langston from Bloomberg Business Week. Welcome back to the show, Nate.
Thanks very much for having me, guys.
I appreciate getting you on, and I love that you call it the reckoning because that makes it sound so fatal, although I don't know if it actually is, but let's dive into it and see if that's the case. You start off your piece talking a little bit about PayPal and how they're suspending hundreds of accounts, and it kind of points back to the terms of service, kind of an interesting angle. What's going on there exactly?
Yeah, it's interesting. I mean, this story started out actually when I was looking into to this issue with PayPal. I'd sort of heard from a few people here in Europe, millennials, that they had had their accounts closed by PayPal because they were underage at the time that they signed up for the service. They were under 18. Part of the problem is that they're now in their late 20s, and so these closures have been happening about 10 years or so after their accounts initially opened. And they all came about by PayPal asking them for some ID because they were trying to move some, money, legitimate money, out of the account. They needed proof of ID. They noticed, PayPal that is, noticed that they were underage when they signed up a decade ago and said they were going to close the account and what have you. So it was very, very bizarre. But then during the congressional hearings with Mark Zuckerberg the other week, there was one of the senators had sort of waved this giant stack of papers at Zuckerberg and said, I'm a lawyer and I don't understand this, or words to that effect, sort of talking about the fact that these terms and conditions are just gigantic, full of legalese, no one pays attention to them. And Zuckerberg said that he doesn't think people actually pay attention to these. And when I went back to PayPal, the only thing that they told me is that they close these accounts in order for people to be able to legally accept the terms and conditions. But PayPal's terms and conditions are currently about 60,000 words long. So that's longer than The Great Gatsby. It's twice as long as George Orwell's Animal Farm. It's longer than many very popular novels. And it just made me think that this is a huge issue, but it's also a huge issue just about time before we move into what's called GDPR, which I'm sure we'll talk about in a bit. But it's essentially new regulations in Europe about data protection. But there's a big element of that around user consent, which directly relates to terms and conditions. So I sort of packaged all this up into one piece to sort of really step back and say, wow, this has been having a real effect on people in this new way that we're sort of learning about with PayPal. But more broadly speaking, this is probably not something that's going to be able to happen legally in future for European citizens.
So what's the solution to this problem, though? Because, I mean, we all know we can't have nice things because people do bad things with nice things. So you have to have some sort there have to be terms and conditions. There has to be and they almost have to be that long. It's just the world that we live in. So what's the solution?
Well, I mean, part of the argument is that they don't have to be that long. And really, it comes down to the sort of the classic KISS rule, keep it simple, stupid, It's about making things understandable to the average person. So PayPal may have 60,000 words in its current terms of service, but, the vast majority of that, A, probably isn't relevant to most people, and B, the bits that are relevant are not necessarily that easy to understand. So the idea is that these terms and conditions should be made much more understandable, break them down, make it easy for people to understand. If they need to read into more detail, offer that. saying that these terms and conditions should completely disappear and go away. Legally, as you say, they need to be there to protect people and to protect businesses. But that moment that you're giving consent for things like your data to be processed, for example, or for your money to be held by a company, you have to, under GDPR, be able to give informed consent, or rather a company has to show that a user gave informed consent for their data or money or whatever it is to be processed. And it cannot be considered informed if you have to plow through 60,000 words of legalese. So the way that this will have to work is a balance, that users will have to be able to generally understand what they're being signed up to or what terms they're being held to when using a service. And a company has to be able to say that they tried their best to make sure it was understood, and then it's okay. And then the terms and conditions can still be lengthy behind that if needs be, but at least they can say, well, a user was informed enough to give their consent for their data to be used.
Yeah, standardizing this in a way that, like in my head, I envision headings and subheadings that are collapsible to give you the broad sense of what this particular part is about. And then if you really want to dive in there and get even more detailed information, you can. But I guess that's a lot to ask and format for all the companies that are doing this. Not to mention, companies, probably to at least a certain degree, are okay with the fact that this stuff is confusing, right? Like in doing so, in making it so dense, people might be more inclined to do what they're doing now, which is just to say, well, I want into here, and I realize I should probably read through this, but I want in here, so I'm going to do it anyways, and the company could stand to gain a lot from that.
Yeah, and what's interesting about this is that this isn't really a new issue. This has been going on for a very, very long time. There was a very interesting case, which I did include in the piece, back in 2005, where a software security company put a line in its terms and conditions that essentially said, if somebody spots this line and tells us about it, you'll win a prize. And someone did 4 months later, and they got $1,000. And it sort of proved that it took thousands of downloads of a piece of software and 4 months for just one person to come forward and say, hey, I read your EULA and I saw this thing about a prize. Can I have it, please? And there's some really weird ones as well. If you Google Amazon Web Services living flesh, put that actual term in, it sounds weird, but there's one of the terms of service in AWS for a specific bit of the software that you can use there actually has a clause in it that references how I think it's something like the software can't be used for certain things in the instance that there's an apocalypse and the dead rise up and try and consume living human flesh or something like that. I'm not kidding. It's in there if you Google it. It's been widely covered and actually got cut out of my feature. But this has just been going on for a very long time, and it's kind of got to a bit of a crunch now with GDPR. But I've got off on a bit of a tangent, but what I was going to say is that
I like this tangent, by the way, because that was very
flesh
unclear.
will do that to you.
It's easy to go on a tangent with zombies, but there was one kind of an analyst, an expert in legal proceedings that I spoke to around this, and I sort of asked him, like, what's a really good solution? What can a company do in order to try and say, look, we did our best. We've got to have these terms, but we tried to give people informed consent. And one of the ideas, he said, is that you could sort of walk people through an initial set of terms, and they have to understand each bit. Do you understand this? Do you understand this? Do you understand this? Kind of like one of those capture things. And you say, yes, yes, yes. And then you can sort of say, well, you gave informed consent. They tried their best. Problem to that, obviously, is that that's a major roadblock if you're trying to encourage quick signups and conversions. So there's going to be this balanced middle ground where companies don't want to put up a giant roadblock like a huge registration form or giant sets of terms and all this kind of stuff. But at the same time, they have to be able to show that they did their best to clearly explain, what data is going to be used for in order for someone to give their consent.
So informed consent is what's at issue here. And there's a difference between terms and conditions and a privacy policy, and sometimes we confuse them. But a privacy policy is you're not giving informed consent to that. Like we just say, like make sure you read the privacy policy. But then if you find out something in it and you want to bring a case against them for that if it's not part of the terms and conditions that you've signed. So is that one way of getting around this? Just putting these things in the privacy policy so that we are informed but not giving our consent?
Well, there's a yes answer and a no answer to that, and part of the problem is that GDPR isn't enforced yet, and companies so far have sort of been reluctant to show their hand up until as recently as this week to say we are GDPR compliant and we have updated our terms and all this sort of thing. So we haven't yet really seen loads of examples of how companies are going to get around this. But the bottom line is that, you know, the difference between informed consent and consent is that, you know, it's very simple. The idea of a pre-ticked checkbox to say you've read something or agreed to something just cannot happen anymore, you know, because, you know, that is sort of an assumption that you've given consent. You can blindly click something and not realize you've agreed to something. That will just have to go away. You know, that just won't do. Things have to be clearer. You can't have, you know, pre-ticked checkboxes and things like that. And it's going to have to be much, much more easy to understand up front before you agree to give any of your data away.
Yeah, maybe I realize you were talking about, you know, these barriers that potentially prohibit someone from wanting to sign up, but maybe you quiz them. Wouldn't that be fun? You go to a site, you read the terms of service, you can't get in here until you take a quiz and tell us. No, that wouldn't be fun at all. What doesn't make me feel very good about the possibilities that surround this is the correlation to what we already experience with permissions on smartphones, right? Like, we're constantly in this state of not truly understanding exactly what apps have access to, even though we've explicitly said, yes, you can have access to my camera, or yes, you can have access to the contacts. And that's a much simpler, I feel like, kind of delivery of what we're saying okay to. You know, the permissions when we install an app is kind of already doing what we're talking about here. It's got a header that says contacts, and then there's a little bit more information about it, but it's still very obscure, and yet we still say okay, even though something like, you know, Cambridge Analytica or who knows what else happens. So it doesn't really give me a whole lot of positive thoughts of as far as the possibilities here. What do you think?
Yeah, that's definitely true. I mean, you know, one of the big differences between that and you know what's happening with GDPR is that with the permissions on a device, you know, accessing your camera, you know, it's fairly simple. You know what you're getting. You know, it does, as we old term in Britain, it does what it says on the tin. You know, we know that, okay, you're accessing my camera because you need to take pictures, or you need my contacts because this is a social app. That's fine. But with services and with networks and with financial companies, there's so much more that they can do with your information, your data. You know, who's it being shared with? What companies is it being shared with? Do you have a right to revoke those permissions? Where's the data being stored? You know, all of this stuff is what's made possible under GDPR for somebody to get access to. You know, they will have a maximum, companies that is, will have a maximum of 30 days to respond to a request, giving you information about where your data is stored, literally, you know, the location, the country that it's in, what companies have access to it, what companies have had access to it, in addition to obviously all the data itself. And then you can request to have the whole lot wiped completely. And if they don't comply with this, or other failures to comply with this are punishable by up to 4% of your global sales, you know, which is just a gigantic amount of money. You know, you think about how much that is for the likes of Google and Facebook, and it's why they have hundreds, probably thousands of people working on this now. You know, there's kind of no wiggle room here. They've got to get it right.
So what responsibility lies with the company itself? Using your PayPal example, the woman who is 26 now signed up to use the service when she was 16. They didn't check that. They didn't prove that then. So how much of this lies in the companies itself to enforce those types of terms of services and service, and not wait a decade to enforce them?
Well, that's the thing. I mean, you know, in the PayPal example, you know, I didn't want to be, you know, crazy harsh on them, because at the end of the day, what they were doing was essentially totally in their rights. You know, it was a user who signed up underage. The terms did say that they couldn't sign up before they were 18, and yet they did. And so PayPal shut down the account. You know, what was kind of maddening for these people is that it was 10 years later, and they'd obviously given PayPal a load of fees and things in the meantime. But it kind of means that that companies will still be able to act on breaches of terms and conditions. You know, it will be separate from that age gate sort of policy. Like they don't have to necessarily say, we have to put in these age checks or some kind of identification procedure in order to make sure that you're complying with the terms. They just have to make sure that they've made it clear at the point you sign up what those rules are. After that, you know, if you break those rules, if you break your side of those of that agreement, then, you know, the same process can happen. The only real difference is that a user will have a better defense to say, well, look, this is 60,000 words of legalese. You know, how was I supposed to read this and understand this? How could I give informed consent? You know, I was just giving consent. It wasn't informed, because how can I understand all this? That's kind of the key difference here. So it'll be separate from age checks. It'll be separate from a lot of stuff, but it's just going to have to be very, very clear to a user what they're agreeing to.
Yeah.
They can still break it.
Yeah, absolutely. Nate Langston with Bloomberg. Really appreciate you taking time, especially out of your late evening, to join us on the show today. Where do you want people to follow all this stuff you're doing online?
Yeah, well, I mean, Twitter is the best place, at Nate Langston, NATELANXON. I post links to all my stuff that I write for Bloomberg and for my own podcast there as well. And I've just posted a link to that feature in case anyone wants to check the link and read that.
Awesome. Nate, thank you so much for joining us. We'll talk to you soon.
Thank you very much.
Thanks, Nate.
All right, take care, Nate.
And you're listening to Northwest Tech Show on KMUZ. I'm Dave Duncan, joined by Nate Darnell. And
Hey.
that was a coffee delay. Hey,
Yeah, it was.
And that was a little Creative Commons clip from twit.tv, GDPR, and terms of service clarity.
Yeah.
This has long been kind of a thorn in my side because, you know, my understanding, you know, from my, you know, one term of business law was that contracts were supposed to represent a meeting of the minds, and you couldn't have a meaningful contract where one of the parties had not actually consented to it. You know, all this, you know, elaborate stuff on the mechanisms on, you know, when an offer is good and when it's accepted and all this. And then along came shrink-wrapped software with a license inside it that you were presumed to have agreed to by buying it, even though it was physically impossible to read it before using it.
Plus, you couldn't use the software until you clicked that you had read it all, even though you didn't read it all.
Yeah, which was just extended on. And this, you know, this polite fiction extended on into the online world for many, many years, till years later, Nate, they suddenly say, hey, if all this stuff is not actually being read, then we can't consider this method of delivery to be meaningful consent. Hallelujah. Would have been a nice ruling 20 years ago. But this is where international law is starting to kick in. Before it was kind of the U.S. doing their own thing. And now this is, you know, kind of kickback of, you know, hey, we're you know, becoming one world electronically, and, you know, we have to have, you know, some laws that are acceptable to everybody. And that's why slippery slopes are even worse now than ever, because if you don't have the leading countries kind of hold the line on these important principles, you know, any compromises that, you know, the United States and or Britain say, well, you know, it's okay to hose people in X, Y, and Z way, then all the, you know, third world dictator types will say, oh, well, you know, if the U.S. and Britain says it's okay to spy on your people, then we're definitely going to do that. You know, it was only reluctantly, slowly, they were being dragged into some measure of respect for their people, because they would get all these trade sanctions and such and political pressure and lack of assistance in general from the big countries if they didn't, you know, toe the line on what the sort of the modern version of understanding of human rights were. So, you know, it's been disappointing, to say the least, in recent years, not just the last couple, but in the last, say, you know, 10, 15 years, to see kind of things marching backwards to a great degree. So I have mixed feelings about laws in one country affecting what's going on in another. I don't really want to be affected by the laws in, Iran or Saudi Arabia. But in this case, the United Kingdom or EU has decided to go in one direction and said, hey, if you want access to, to the degree you want to be in our market, which is one of the biggest ones in the world, you have to comply with these rules. And that has good effects for the rest of us just by follow on, as they generally want to make one product that serves the world. Although I did hear some noise, and I didn't really understand the article, but it was talking about what terms of service were being originated from what country, because a lot of times they have these kind of tax inversions where they, some major league world company like an Apple or Microsoft or something like that will say, oh, for tax purposes, our headquarters is in Ireland, where we don't actually have any people, but we're going to say that's where, we're rooted for tax law. And in some similar kind of way, they're switching around. Facebook is said to be switching around what terms of service apply to us, such that they don't have to worry about this UK ruling, which is disturbing, because I thought that was the one good thing about this international effective law, which really should be a treaty, but what was that it would positively affect and cause companies to say, hey, we're going to actually be clear about, we're going to have the short version of our terms of service that you can actually read on a 8.5 by 11 large print sheet of paper, and not like a book. And so
it's intentionally written to be clear rather than to obfuscate all of the other business dealings we're doing behind the scenes.
Well, and the sensible way to do this, especially in the area where, especially like it's almost always in electronic form that you're seeing these terms of service. It's not printed on a piece of paper for the most part. So, it's very easy to have features like, those little twirl down, drop down triangles that say, here's the 1 or 2 sentence version of this whole section of the terms of service. And if you need more detail on precisely what we mean by that, then you can always, hit the triangle and get more detail and have it expand to the full legalese version. And that to me seems like a good compromise. The lawyers can say, hey, we included everything, as long as they don't, do some, they would then be obligated to have nothing in the fine print legalese be extremely counterintuitive based on, what the top level thing. But if there was some ambiguity in the top level thing and all the following stuff simply clarified that in a reasonable way, then they would be legally safe. And the customer would actually know what they had agreed to.
Yeah, but it's not in the interest of the company to have the customer know.
Well, that's the thing, is now it is, because they get a 4%, up to 4% of their global revenues as a penalty if they, fail to adhere to the UK or EU standard on this.
And there are specific lines of delineation that this standard.
Well, there's a
puts
court.
forth.
There's a court. It's like, okay, we think let's come and argue why you complied with this. We don't think you did.
Right.
The people that were, the people who were actually misled by the terms of service would come forward and said, yeah, I read this. I thought it meant this. And it's like, yeah, that makes sense. What are you saying? Well, it's like, well, why didn't you, why did you say this thing that refers to some minor case and leave the major case be the opposite? Something like that. Like, it's like, well, this is free. And down the fine print, you say, it's like, if you're, between 21 and 22 and live on the West Coast, it's free. It's like, well, the majority case is that it's not free. So, or in this one important clause, it's actually $45,000 that you're agreeing to. Maybe that's worth mentioning at the top level, in some cases up to $45,000 or something like that. And then you'd say, oh, well, I'm going to read down and see what in some cases are, because I want to know if I'm getting it for free or $45,000. And so it'll be interesting. Again, the proof is in the pudding of how these things shake out in actual practice. So, until this goes into effect later this month, we won't know, and the lawsuits start flying, or the case or the complaints start flying. And there will be complaints immediately. I'm sure there are people that have had their complaints stacked up and cross-referenced by color and date for years, waiting for a chance to go after these guys.
Right.
And I think those will be dispensed with pretty quickly. But, anything that's like, oh, well, there's, here we got 10,000 different people that have the same complaint against you, I think that's worth looking into.
I agree.
So hopefully that's where it'll go. But so more news yet again on the GDPR. It's coming. It's like in Game of Thrones. Winter is coming.
I've never watched Game of Thrones.
All the me neither. But I'm up on all the memes.
I don't have time to watch Game of Thrones.
Doesn't stop it from
What's
being...
up with all these people that have time to watch Game of Thrones?
Yeah, well, it doesn't stop it from being a cultural touchstone, does it?
Oh my word! The same
It's like
people
you're
that,
soaking in Game of
the
Thrones.
same
You don't
people
even
that
know.
don't have time to read all these disclaimers and all of these agreements are watching Game of Thrones.
Ain't nobody got time for that, as they say on the Daily Show.
I'm watching Thrones.
Yeah. I'm watching Thrones. Okay, well, speaking of Facebook and their treacherous ways, this seemed like a good time for them to roll out their next idea. That's
the dating service.
That's coming out later this year. Yeah, the Facebook dating service. So here's a Creative Commons clip from twit.tv. This is from This Week in Google 455, Facebook dating service.
This is Twit.
But what else about Facebook? Dating. You mentioned this.
Dating, that's the big news.
And that's fun to talk about. Match is pretty upset, or maybe they're not.
17%.
Publicly, they're not upset, but their stock is not doing very well.
Investors are upset.
Yeah.
At the moment of the announcement, somebody next to me in the hall showed me the screen. It was down 17% in a flash.
Wow.
What's interesting to me about this, I mean, it's kind of what everybody presumed Facebook was from the beginning, and they never did it. And that's what I think it was. I think it was Chris Cox who said, everybody thought that's what we were, but we kind of never did it, and they're doing it now. The interesting thing to me is that Facebook has been strictly focusing on introducing you to people connecting you to people you know. Mm-hmm. And this is an effort to connect you to people you don't know. And at the dating level, and they also say that they want meaningful relationships. So they said, what is more meaningful than, getting married to somebody, falling in love with somebody, getting married? And they said, this is not for hooking up. This is for relationships. But that idea of connecting to people you don't know, I've said on the show many, many times that what I hope for Facebook is it starts to make strangers less strange. If this is the start of a new expertise in an area that's fairly safe and well trod, I think it's interesting. Now, of course, on the internet, everybody's, oh my God, privacy, Facebook. The world knows how to do dating, I think, in lots of ways and newspapers used to do it for years, where I don't think privacy is trod upon. They're thinking this through where your friends will not see your profile. Only people you allow to see your profile will see your profile. The transaction is obvious. I think this function is obvious. And plus they can tie it into things like groups and interests, and it becomes a lot richer. Now that presumes that interests are the right way to find somebody. It could be that, because right now, in my day, how did you do it? We happen to like the same bar, So what are the commonalities that will bring people together for a meaningful relationship? And are they on Facebook? Really interesting to me.
I wonder if this... I wonder if this increases the filter bubble in a sense. Like, dating is one area where and it's been a long time since I've dated, so let's say that.
None of us can play with this.
I know. I'm like, I could, but I think my husband would be upset. So
yeah.
It's an idea where you actually you meet someone without knowing all that much about them, and then you go in and you encounter these bumps in the road where you're like, oh my God, this person voted for Trump. Could I really date someone who voted for Trump? But that presumably wouldn't happen on Facebook, but it's kind of a fun, that's kind of the interesting part about dating, or
right.
The human part about dating.
Is whether you find other interests that tie you together. I think that's the secret to civility is going to be when we get off the Trump v. Clinton world and start to say, oh, we both like surfing, and we like literature, we like other things, and find other commonalities. That's potential. By the way, so this is going to be image free for security at the start. At some point, you obviously connect and meet each other and see each other. But at the first, this is not about doing the origins of Facebook and the lookbook of
I
seeing
wonder if
image,
they'll
image,
get
image,
guys.
not Tinder.
That's an interest. Like, I can imagine women being like, hot diggity. So I guess guys will go where the women are, but that's an intriguing option.
It's really interesting, isn't it? So you'll have a profile, right? But you can put whatever you want in profile. You can put your cartoon avatar in there, your Oculus avatar. Who knows? But you won't be sending back porny pictures or anything. You'll be talking.
Okay, people will still send back porny pictures.
Sure,
eventually.
I'm married.
There's going to be ASCII. There's going to be ASCII porn. I mean, there was in the text days. Someone will just
highly realistic ASCII porn. Yeah.
But I have to say, I don't really see this as having a chance in hell of succeeding. I think this is going to be one of those things that 6 months from now, Facebook is going to shut it down, and it'll die without a ripple. I just don't see. This is a company that everyone is talking about privacy and their data. So now they're going to
everyone, Matthew, everyone, or just us in media? Everyone.
No, everyone.
Lots of
I have
people I
normal
talk
people.
to mention it. Normal people, civilians, and so now they're going to think, you know what I should do? I should give Facebook a lot of dating information, and my sexual proclivities or something or whatever. Is this information that people are going to want to share with Facebook? I don't think so. Plus, Match.com and those things are perfectly successful. What
I'm
niche is
intrigued by
Facebook
putting
serving?
sexual proclivities on your dating profile, Matthew. That seems real forward.
Yeah.
As a user, how much of creating that profile that exists outside of your friend's profile, like, do you build that from the ground up?
Yeah, you build that yourself. Yeah, that's the thing. That's what you're doing. And of course, there's a big age problem here, is because when I was young and single, the only thing you could do then was personals ads in the New York Review of Books if you were snotty and intellectual, right? And there was no such structure. And young people today, couple after couple, how did you meet? Online.
Right.
There was a stigma about that in the time that went away like that. I talked to a woman some years ago who spent 7 years in Japan, and then she came and she did a great blog about being single, and then she came back to the U.S. and she was just gobsmacked about how suddenly that which had cooties before was now the way to date. And it changed it, because when I was involved in Conde Nast and Bridal, yes, I was. What I learned was that the audience for those kinds of things spins out very quickly. So the norm can change very quickly. So when we owned Brides and Modern Bride and Elegant Bride, we thought we owned Bridal. Along came The Knot, and they stole the market because they had new functionality in a new way. So Matthew, I think it depends strictly on how smart they are and what they add. People may not like going through Match, or may not like going through these services and paying for them, by the way, was the point. Now they can do it in a place where they already have some comfort and some other content.
Well, the key to something like Match, according to their commercials, is how well they can actually connect people. In Facebook, what will be interesting is how much of the iceberg you actually create versus what Facebook uses to match you to someone. Because I may say all kinds of things in my dating profile, but Facebook knows who I really am.
Yeah, it's
to
true.
a certain extent.
Mm-hmm.
And if it finds people based on that versus just what I put on there, then it becomes really interesting. And if people do meet their life partners or whatever in these things, it's compelling. People will use it.
But there's going to be lots of people who don't want that. Like, there's going to be lots of people.
Well, those people don't have to sign
up. They
up.
don't have to opt in. Yeah, they don't opt in.
Yeah, I just think those are going to be the majority of the market. I don't think Facebook. It strikes me every time Facebook tries to launch. I saw a list of the things that it has tried that have failed. Remember, it had a Groupon clone. It had. There's a long list, and I think every time they try and sort of target a vertical like this, it seems to fail, because people, I think, want to go to a site or a service that's dedicated to that thing. They don't want to mix it all in with the other stuff they do on Facebook.
However, what's different with this versus something like a Groupon clone, and we could talk about the many different avenues that Facebook makes money. That might be one way, but when you're talking about Facebook at its core, relationships is like its biggest selling point, and this is a very major other aspect of the relationships that we as human beings enjoy on a daily basis. So from that perspective, it kind of makes sense to me that they might actually be really good at this. If they're not using the wide range of information that they've been gathering on users over the course of however many years to help inform how those matchups happening, then I think they're doing it wrong. From their perspective, because that's the power of the Facebook network.
Yeah, the problem will be obviously that is where the privacy is could bite them.
Right.
Is if how did it know that I'm a foot fetishist like you are?
Right.
When did we reveal that?
Right.
By the way, I'm not. But yeah, those moments when you don't know what's going to come out. So how do they fence off that? But on the other hand, it becomes really interesting. With enough data, they could make better, longer-lasting marriages.
Right.
Right.
Well,
And we don't know what it'll be, why that is, but they could find that AI.
And we might just inherently distrust them, rather. We might be like, oh my gosh, you like weird esoteric thing, and I like weird Facebook. What kind of shenanigans are you pulling?
Right.
When it's really just natural. Because there's a name for this when you think about something and then you see it everywhere. So
Yes.
once you're suspicious, you're going to assume the worst, or maybe just we will.
What is the name for that?
Carson
I don't
knows.
know.
He's scrambling.
That is the Bader-Meinhof phenomenon.
Yes.
Now you'll notice
right.
that in all media for the
You'll see Bader-Meinhof everywhere.
And it's a big reason why many people probably think that Facebook is recording them through the microphone and then surfacing ads. It's just like once you clue in, you see it. You see patterns.
I was talking about this, and then Facebook showed me an ad. I don't know. I've had that conversation. I don't know how many times.
Yeah.
Yes.
And you're listening to Northwest Tech Show on KMUZ. That was a clip from twit.tv. This week in Google 455, Facebook dating service. And as we were during the break, we were just going, great. So we can continue all our superficial connections.
Unhealthy, codependent relationships.
We can continue them in the real world with new people.
That's correct.
On the same basis.
But you know what? I think why there's this drive for online relationships is because it's really easy to break up with them.
Oh, interesting.
You just turn them off, right?
You ghost them.
It's the same thing with texting.
Yeah.
When you're doing it in real time, face to face, you have to have like legitimate, strong reasons to break that relationship.
Yeah.
You have to have very strong communication skills. You've got to have a lot of courage.
Yeah.
And frankly speaking, a lot of people just don't possess those, especially younger people.
Just no one can sell the "it's not you, it's me" line. They just it's like, no, it's you.
But you know what I think the other issue too is, I mean, I just have a hard rule. I won't date somebody unless
that's the rule.
Unless there is marriage potential. That's it. I'm not going to waste my time. I'm not going to waste my energy.
Yeah.
Unless I know that there is marriage potential right out of the chute. I'm not even going to date them. And that is just me.
Yeah, I kind of had a struggle when we were doing the Pick Me series on KMUZ a few years ago, and I went on as a guinea pig.
Yeah.
As soon as it started, I was like, I had the same feeling. I was like, I don't really want to do this unless I feel like it's something that could, be something substantial.
Right. So my friends and I had this great line. One of my dearest friends, and we had this discussion the other day. She's been married for many years, has kids. I'm like the only one of our friends that hasn't been married yet. Yeah. Of course, I was the first out of the chute.
Last holdout.
I'm the last holdout. And, but we have a lot of the same values. And I'm like, look, I don't get the hookup culture. There's way too much liability involved in it. I don't want to manage. I don't know how maybe, you know what it is? Maybe it's just the fact that I grew up with all strong-willed women. And I'm like, look, I can barely manage one. I don't know how you try to manage seven. But the difference being is that they don't get a whole bunch of strong-willed women. They get compliant, easy women. And then they try to manage all seven of them. Still, it's not in my interest.
No, it doesn't work.
It doesn't work. All right, so I'm just like, look, here was our final say on this
topic. There's of course the fatal attraction scenario.
Yes, and then here was our final word on this. I said, you know what? You may have friends with benefits. I have friends with standards.
Ooh, I like it.
I mean, I realize there are some people that like online dating has worked out really well for them. It's just not my cup of tea. I'm very old-fashioned. And I'm like, look, there's a separation between like my work and online life.
I go to Olga the matchmaker. She tells me who I'm going to hook up with. Done. That's
pretty much. But ultimately, when I go home, like I'm not online.
Yeah.
I mean, I like if I'm online, I'm working. That's what I'm doing in terms of my work, my job, and then I disconnect. Like I don't want to have
into brain dead mode and looking for like-minded brain deads.
And then I'm working with like real people and like walking the real dog.
Yeah.
You know, not a robotic dog.
Building the real business. And,
Exactly. You know, and I set those very healthy boundaries. Some people don't have any boundaries. Some people have like they like not having any boundaries. And that's just not me. I need regimen. I need like boundaries.
Some people have 10-foot tall fence boundaries with barbed wire on the top. Some have a little string.
Razor wire.
Yeah, some just have like they just lay a string. They draw, you know, like there's a slight change in the
and
the
some
grass
just,
or something.
and some they're just like I've got no boundaries. Everybody, come on in.
Yeah. Where the boundaries should be, there's just a sign that says, "Welcome to the party."
Oh my word!
All right. I'll give Dave a chance to recover while we go into our next clip. This is something that is. I wouldn't run this on April 1st because this is tech so good and so potentially dystopian, utopian that it'd be kind of hard to believe in most circumstances. So I won't spoil the surprise. This is twit.tv, This Week in Google 456, Google Duplex service.
This is Twit. Here, let me play. This is the thing that, I don't know if this is creepy, but this is very impressive. So this is now another technology that Google announced that is going to allow the assistant to actually place calls on your behalf. Watch this. This one is wild.
Is to help you get things done. It turns out a big part of getting things done is making a phone call. You may want to get an oil change schedule, maybe call a plumber in the middle of the week, or even schedule a haircut appointment. You know, we are working hard to help users through those moments. We want to connect users to businesses in a good way. Businesses actually rely a lot on this, but even in the US, 60% of small businesses don't have an online booking system set up. We think AI can help with this problem. So let's go back to this example. Let's say you want to ask Google to make you a haircut appointment on Tuesday between 10 and noon. What happens is the Google Assistant makes the call seamlessly in the background for you. So what you're going to hear is the Google Assistant actually calling a real salon to schedule the appointment for you. Let's listen.
Now, this is wild. You'll hear, by the way, this sounds like a real assistant. They intentionally have her sticking in ums and pauses. But the thing that's most impressive to me is not that, but how she responds to a real human. And this is like the self-driving car problem. And sometimes humans steer you wrong or say, I mean, and it seemed to do, and of course these are canned demos, but it seemed to do a very good job of handling real-world situations. Listen to this. This is the assistant.
So how can I help you?
That's a real salon.
Hi, I'm calling to book a woman's haircut for a client. I'm looking for something on May 3rd.
That's the assistant. I'm looking for something on May 3rd. That's a computer.
Sure, give me 1 second.
This is a human.
And she's up talking too.
She is. She's up talking.
Sure, what time are you looking
She
for?
said,
At 12 p.m. We do not have a 12 p.m. available. The closest we have to that is a 1:15.
Now, how is the assistant going to deal with that one, right?
Do you have anything between 10 a.m. and 12 p.m.? Depending on what service she would like. What service is she looking for? Just a woman's haircut for now. Okay, we have a 10 o'clock. 10 a.m. is fine. Okay, what's her first name? The first name is Lisa. Okay, perfect.
The first name is
I will
Lisa.
see Lisa at 10 o'clock on May 3rd. Okay, great. Thanks. Great. Have a great day. Bye.
One of the things that scares me about that is that it's clear they're trying to make it fool the receptionist.
Well, did you hear?
Turn around the robocall now.
Yeah, I mean, I can imagine this technology in the wrong hands is terrifying.
And it also...
I get those all the time, don't you? I mean, I get those where they're trying to fake that they're human.
Yeah.
And you ask them, are you a robot? And they have some canned answer, and they're not. Sorry. Go ahead, Stacey.
No, I was very excited from a business perspective. Google's talking about using this for calling restaurants to see if they're open for holiday hours, for example. And that, if you can imagine the automation of data collection at that kind of scale, that is mind-boggling how quickly Google could gain an edge.
Well, and this is really an example. To me, I'm kind of lately on a kick saying, stop calling it AI. That's a marketing term. Machine learning I can live with, but AI is a marketing term, except that this is AI now. This is actually, here, listen to this one. This is a much more challenging call.
I couldn't have done this phone call. I
No.
couldn't have gone through this.
But maybe it's a small restaurant which is not easily available to book online. The call actually goes a bit differently than expected. So take a listen.
See how may I help you?
Hi, I'd like to reserve a table for Wednesday the 7th.
For 7 people?
Okay, so the human misunderstood the assistant. He was saying at 7 p.m. She thought he said for 7 people.
Maybe she's a robot. That would be awesome.
She did a worse job of understanding him than he does of understanding, or it does of understanding her. She's actually pretty difficult to understand. Listen to how this continues. So she's already throwing it. I got to say it. It's really tempting to say him, isn't it? It a curve.
It's for 4 people.
4 people when? Today?
Next Wednesday at 6 p.m.
Oh, actually, we leave here for after 5 people.
Now, if you are not watching the video and didn't see the caption, what the human just said is, we only allow reservations for more than 5 people. So
4 people you can come.
For 4 people you can come.
How long is the wait usually to be seated?
Now, that's actually the right response to that, which is, I don't need a reservation. Well, how long will I have to wait? That's a very sophisticated, I think, response.
When, tomorrow or weekday or?
For next Wednesday, the 7th.
Oh, no, it's not too busy. You can come for 4 people, okay?
Oh, I gotcha. Thanks.
Bye-bye.
Wow.
This is Turing test level.
Turing test level. This is beyond. Yeah, this is very impressive.
When are they announcing this? Because this reminds me, remember Facebook M, but they put the person in the loop for as things got more complicated?
Yeah.
Facebook actually killed that project with the people. They kept the M AI efforts, and they're bringing that back for their smart speaker, it sounds like. But this is, and I've got a lot of questions about, was this, obviously, it's not a live demo. So
they said they had a lot, I don't remember the number, of calls in the can. But my impression is this is an actual project, right? So that means it's something they're working on. And
Google Duplex.
Google Duplex. And it's my sense that this is something they're working on. They didn't say coming soon to a phone near you.
Well, but about almost a year ago, I talked on the show about BetaWorks had a voice accelerator and demo session, and they showed exactly this, where it calls off and makes an appointment or buys flowers or whatever. So these are companies outside Google working on this. The other interesting thing is, seriously, you also get the opportunity at a really wacky level to have robot to robot in voice.
Right.
Rather than having to have voice becomes the API.
But you don't even need voice at that point. If you got robot to robot, they could go. Done.
They could well develop their own. When we've seen that with AI, it does kind of make up its own language.
Right.
They could make up an AI language, but you don't need a data communication. You don't need an API. Audio becomes that connection, which is fascinating.
And you're listening to Northwest Tech Show on KMUZ. That was twit.tv, This Week in Google 456, talking about a new feature being added by Google to Google Assistant later at some point later, maybe later this year, Google Duplex. Actually, they didn't even say later this year. It's just something they're working on. I'm Dave Duncan, joined by Nate Darnell, who is about swallowing his tongue about how terribly dystopian
it is terribly dystopian, but more importantly, I'm laughing because I was, while listening to that, I was trying to find I was trying to find a text that one of my friends sent me, who was visiting Portland, and this was like 2 months ago.
Yeah.
And I called and left a voicemail because we were trying to meet up when in Portland.
Sure.
And it translated it and sent it to her in a text message.
Wow.
And it was this totally garbled message. It said, "This is a message from Lawrence."
Wow.
And then
Kansas? I don't know.
And then it went on to basically utter out this gibberish that sounded like the person was on drugs and trying to pick them up, and they were prostitutes.
Well, to be fair, Nate, you were on drugs, weren't you?
I mean, she ignored the message she told me.
It's like, that's a crazy person's message.
She said, "I thought this was sent to me by accident, or I thought somebody stole your phone."
And just didn't rise to a level that warranted a response.
And then she listened to the genuine voicemail, and she was like, "I have no idea how this text message came out of this voicemail."
Well, one of the keys, I think, is the landline versus a cell phone.
I think possibly, but I still think some of it is just the translation software. And I mean, we were laughing so hard we were crying. Because
I'm sure she kept that one.
Because what she did, she has it. Because
trying that one. Take a picture and make that a poster.
I mean, it was something along the lines of, "Hey, if you ladies are still in town and not arrested, I'd like to get together." Yeah. I mean, that was really what it was saying.
All the discernible nouns, when you strung them together, that was the only sentence you could make.
And it was like, "If you want to get together for some fun, if you're not arrested," it was great. It was really hilarious.
You're probably like something like, if you're well rested or something like that is probably what you said.
Well, but, I was sick, number one, and I mean, it was hard for me just to say anything without coughing.
Yeah.
So no doubt that had something to do with the translation, but still. Oh man, the kinds of stuff that computers can do.
Yeah, and the things that they can mess up. Well, a lot of times I noticed, like when Google Voice was first rolling out, early on its translations were much better, and then they got worse. And I think they were experimenting with, okay, how little amount of computing time can we throw at this and still have it work?
See, I think there's a different algorithm. I think what they're doing is they're matching like syntax and communication structure, not based on high level academics and standards, but based on like colloquial conversation.
Yeah.
And it starts to devolve because every subsequent generation has like a lower level of capability. and so, I mean, if you're trying to develop, a reservoir of data for this artificial intelligence to operate from, it's really, in my opinion, best to pull from a high caliber source and then help coach the rest of the population on how to communicate effectively rather than to teach the machine how to communicate poorly. I mean, that's just my opinion.
No, that totally makes sense, and that's one of the places we're going to have to go with this, I guess. But just a couple of points I wanted to throw out. That was some thoughts I had when I was listening to this. Was first that Duplex name kind of reminded me of the old Duplex acoustical modems. Where it's a computer talking over a phone. So that's probably where that came from. Keep in mind that as impressive as these examples were, they were probably cherry-picked from a bunch of experiments they were doing. And I'm sure that they had task-specific decision trees designed for each of those interactions. So it's almost like, a car driving down a street that has been carefully arranged for the car to go down. It's like, okay, that's kind of useful, but I mean, it's kind of interesting, in a kind of theoretical way, but not practical yet. So there have been things before, like systems that were kind of cobbled together where someone hand-tailored a bunch of specific solutions for specific problems, and then the algorithm is just to decide which of these things is the one to use. And sometimes that's kind of awkward because as those skills evolve, as the context evolves, you have a whole bunch of stuff that needs to be tweaked, and that can be rough. So while this was really impressive, it's not definitive yet. But for specific applications, so the use of this thing as a general purpose tool for your Google Assistant may be a ways away, but I can see some pretty evil applications here.
Unquestionably.
I mean, there was a guy who successfully just using a homebrew version of an Asterisk voicemail system. He was able to make a telemarketer honeypot that wasted up to 20 minutes of a telemarketer's time by pretending to be a person that was being distracted by a bee or by a baby or something like that while they're trying to do their pitch. And there's like, oh, I'm sorry. They sense a lull. It's like, I'm sorry, what were you saying? I was distracted by this bee that's in the room. What were you saying? And it would get them talking again, right? Just keep them on the line as long as possible. It was just like remarkably successful. And that was a real person laying down the dialogue, but the same principle applies. It occurs to me that you could automate the process of social engineering, where you call up and impersonate someone who, like you pretend to be a phone technician in order to get, information that you're not normally allowed, the public's not normally allowed, because you're using the right buzzwords and you're confident and you have familiarity with a couple of key people in the organization.
Especially if Facebook makes all of your information public. So then that software can look at all that data.
Yeah, all that information is for sale.
And then pick source words that it knows are going to be, that you're going to be attracted to.
Yeah, if not directly from Facebook, then there are data brokers out there that have this stuff. I mean, private detectives can get this stuff.
Right.
So, there's some frightening. This is some socially nuclear level kind of.
This is why I'm doing with my phone altogether.
All right. Well, on that fun and terrifying point, it's probably time to wrap things up. And with that, you've done it again. You spent an hour talking with Dave and Nate about technologies and about how better understanding can empower you at home, at work, and in your civic engagements. I hope you'll join us next week and every week to continue the conversation on Northwest Tech Show.